Sad to bad.
All right, so the first story we got to talk about here is what's going on in Syria. Me and Will got some nice maps for people looking on the YouTube feed here. You can see that Syria is still will looks like mostly Syrian government control. However, there's this big yellow chunk of map that is was that east of the Euphrates River. That's almost all this orange color that represents, the U.S. government and our proxy forces, the SDF and the YPG. So, why is the U.S. sticking more troops in Syria right now? What's happening?
Well, there's a little bit of mixed messages coming from the government about why they're doing this. But on Friday, I think what you're referring to is this military deployment. They sent I think 6 Bradley fighting vehicles, which are like these small little tank type. It's not quite like an Abrams or something, but it's still basically a tank. It's a little more than an armored personnel carrier. And I think they sent it was fewer than 100 soldiers to northeastern Syria. We don't know exactly where they're going to be operative, but you can see in this map here that is the region they were deployed to. That is primarily where the U.S. presence is in Syria right now, with the exception of a small little pocket in the south near the Al-Tanf area. However, in terms of like the reasoning, the rationale given for why they did this deployment on Friday, all of the official announcements are saying, they're mentioning ISIS and, ensuring the enduring defeat of the Islamic State and all this stuff. But interestingly, some officials went to NBC and CNN anonymously, military officials, and said that this deployment is meant to be a quote clear signal to Russia. And they mentioned something about avoiding unprofessional actions and provocative behavior and all this stuff. So it does sound to me like that is actually the real intended goal here, is sending this message to Russia. Um, and listeners might recall in a previous episode we covered this thing a couple weeks ago. This scuffle between American and Russian vehicles doing patrols up in northeastern Syria in the same region, where you ended up having this collision between a Russian and American vehicle, and the Pentagon says that between 4 and 7 U.S. soldiers were injured in that. So it does actually seem like this very likely is a response to that incident, and some other similar little scuffles we've had with the Russians lately. Um, so there wasn't too much to this whole thing. The Pentagon didn't put out a ton of information about this deployment. We just got, it's going to be some Bradley fighting vehicles, and they're in northeastern Syria. But obviously this is a continuation of our occupation there. It's kind of ironic. Just a couple hours before this deployment, the president was bragging how we're out of Syria and how we we'd mostly gotten out of Syria, and like apparently not, because we're still sending in soldiers and vehicles and stuff. This wasn't a huge deployment, but it's still just like I want to see things going in the opposite direction, and that's the direction Trump keeps saying he wants to go in, is to pull out soldiers and vehicles, but he's still sending them in.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of the interesting thing that stood out to me about this story is you kind of had the worst of the false narratives from both the Republicans and the Democrats coming out here, like this idea that Trump is somehow anti-war and is trying to end the endless wars, and yet really everything he does made sure that they continue to go on. I mean, maybe something like, oh, Syria, you could say that since his, he escalated it in 2017, has wound it down some, wound some down Iraq some after a major escalation, and the air war in Afghanistan has, since wound down that war a little bit. But for the most part, it's not like Donald Trump isn't carrying out a ton of military operations. And so, they have this whole narrative that he's somehow going to end the endless wars. And this is just another clear example of that not happening. Then you have the entirety of left wing Twitter tweeting all day long about how the president's in the pocket of Vladimir Putin and how he's never confronted Russia. And yet we're still in Syria to confront Russia. And, they never really have to reckon with the fact that no matter how many times they claim that Donald Trump is a puppet of Vladimir Putin, he's, done things that are clearly aggressive towards Russia, and this is just the latest example. So I want to, kind of ask you, Will, is there any details on what this, like, I know you went over like some of the, how many people are going to be there, the deployments. Are they going to like try to prevent Russia from doing anything, or are they just like trying to say, hey, Russia, we would be willing to, step things up a little bit if you are?
Yeah, I kind of got the idea this is more just a show of force. Like, I don't think there's, they, like I said, they only sent like a dozen or so vehicles, fewer than 100 soldiers. So this isn't like a major escalation where it's going to have like a real important outcome on the battlefield. But I do just think it's sort of like a show of force. Like, hey, we're beefing up our presence here a little bit. They said they'd also step up air patrols over the, northeastern region as well, in addition to the deployment. So I guess they're just kind of saying like, hey, Russia, like we're going to be a little more active in this area, so you better watch out. Because the Russians, of course, they also carry out patrols. That was what we saw with that footage, with that tense encounter between the American and Russian vehicles. They were both on patrols, and in that case, the Russians claimed that hey, like we gave the Americans our patrol route, but the U.S. says that the Russians were like acting provocative and aggressive, and that they pursued them. And so there's some dispute over how some of these things unfold. But nonetheless, I do think this deployment is just a matter of like hey, like it's just a show of force basically.
Right. Yeah, I read somewhere that it was supposed to last 90 days. And so I guess that the troops just go to some U.S. stronghold near the border with, Syria and Iraq, that they could not in any way really add to, at least on the ground, any tensions between the U.S. and Russia or Syria. Then again, they could stick these soldiers at a checkpoint somewhere where maybe the Syrian government or the Russians are interested in having a checkpoint nearby. And I, can see it like adding to the tensions and, just things getting worse. So I guess the last thing I was wondering, I'm sure you don't have an answer to because we're talking about the thoughts of Donald Trump here, but coming to the election, in one sense, it seems like Donald Trump has this idea that what he needs to do is make foreign policy deals and wins, and he knows that Americans want to end wars, and so he's trying to, wrap things up in Afghanistan or something like talking about drawing down soldiers in Iraq, and then he does something like this. And so, do we have any idea? I guess the official explanation as to why Trump made this decision is to counter Russia and Syria, but what advisors are advising him to do this are how he goes from we're withdrawing 3,000 troops from Iraq to, oh yeah, we're adding 100 in Syria.
Yeah, he does seem to be trying to walk this like tightrope with his like campaigning, where he wants to be able to sell his like all the successes. To him, a success is like a deal or like successfully withdrawing troops or something from Afghanistan from some quagmire. But then he also has this other idea on the other end that like you also have to like talk tough and do all this tough tough guy stuff and like really show other countries, like show our adversaries like China and Russia and stuff, that we mean business. And like Iran and all that. So I think that's sort of, this falls into that category of that second type of like campaign move where he's like trying to show that, hey, we mean business and we'll act tough if we need to, because that is something he's been he's come under fire for, obviously for I think a ridiculous reason, that he's been too like too easy on Russia or something. Like, that's absurd if you look at his actual policies, things like this, these types of deployments, the sanctions that he's imposed. Like clearly he's not just given Vladimir Putin a free pass or something. But I think he is trying to combat that perception a little bit, because people are claiming that all the time about him. And so I think this move could kind of fit that bill, that he's trying to combat the perception that he's too easy on Putin.
Right. Well, they're certainly making a lot of room out of this story, even if it doesn't end up being much. Just the kind of way they ran it as an expose and everything. It seems like they're trying to get a lot of headlines here. Do you have anything else to add on Syria, Will?
No, I would just suggest people, if they want to see the maps and stuff, you can go to southfront.org. They have a lot of